The battlefield of the Second World War was not only shaped by men, but by machines that roared, burned, and bled beside them. When soldiers climbed into their steel beasts, they didn't just enter vehicles, they entered coffins on tracks. Tanks were supposed to protect them, but for many in the early years of the war, they were rolling death traps. In 1940, across the deserts of North Africa, on the muddy plains of the Eastern Front, and through the hedgerows of France, tank crews faced a grim truth. Their machines were outmatched. German Panzer IVs, Tigers, and Panthers tore through Allied armor like paper. The Allies called them iron monsters. The Germans called them Kampfwagen. To the men inside the Shermans, Matildas, and T-34s, they were nightmares. But then, something extraordinary happened. As the war dragged on, desperate engineers, mechanics, and frontline innovators began to reforge these machines overnight. They welded scrap metal, bolted on logs, reworked guns, and rewired engines under candlelight and bombed-out workshops. They turned hopeless tanks into juggernauts, not through luxury of time, but through raw necessity. This is the story of that transformation, of how engineers, under the shadow of death and defeat, turned clumsy steel beasts into the unstoppable armor that changed the course of war.
Act 1. The Wolves of Steel. This act explores the terrifying superiority of early German armor and how it forced Allied engineers to rethink tank warfare from the ground up. The first real shock came in 1940, the Blitzkrieg. When panzer divisions rolled across Europe, their coordination was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Radio-linked, fast, and disciplined, they sliced through France in 6 weeks. Allied tanks, slower and poorly armed, were left burning along the roads to Dunkirk. The German Panzer III and IV were masterpieces of mechanical design. With sloped armor, reliable Maybach engines, and the precision of Krupp steel, they weren't just stronger, they were smarter. Their crews could communicate instantly between tanks, calling out targets, adjusting formations, striking like wolves hunting in packs. Meanwhile, British Matildas and French Chars-B lumbered forward blind and deaf, relying on flag signals or hand gestures. By 1941, the Wehrmacht's confidence had become legend. When they invaded the Soviet Union, they faced a new kind of resistance and a new tank, the T-34. It was fast, deadly, and shockingly simple. Its 76mm gun and sloped armor stunned the Germans. For the first time, their panzers met a machine that could both outrun and outfight them. It was a masterpiece, wrote General Heinz Guderian later, the best tank of the war. But while the Soviets could build them by the thousands, the Western Allies were still scrambling. American engineers at Detroit Arsenal tank plant were pushing out M3 Lees and early Shermans, tanks that were, by all accounts, undergunned and thin-skinned. In the deserts of North Africa, they became the hunted. Rommel's Afrika Korps, armed with long-barreled Panzer IVs, picked them off one by one. Crews nicknamed their Shermans Ronsons, after the lighter brand, because they lit up the first time, every time. To many, it seemed hopeless. The Germans had the edge in every measurable way: armor, optics, and firepower. But inside Allied camps and behind the front lines, something else was stirring. A quiet revolution of grease, sweat, and genius. It began not in boardrooms or factories, but in the dirt. Mechanics who had seen too many of their friends die began to improvise, adding makeshift armor, tuning engines, and scavenging enemy parts. In these small acts of desperation, the next great leap in tank warfare was being born.
Act 2. The Mechanics of Survival. This act reveals how Allied engineers, mechanics, and field crews began improvising and re-engineering tanks in the heat of battle, turning desperation into innovation. When the Allies landed in North Africa in 1942, they didn't just bring tanks, they brought floating workshops. Mobile repair units followed every division, carrying welding gear, spare tracks, and hope. In the sandblasted heat, crews learned that victory wouldn't come from factories alone. It would come from men who could outthink death with a wrench in their hands. Sergeant Bill Close of the British 3rd Royal Tank Regiment recalled it vividly. "We'd fight all day, repair all night, and fight again at dawn. The tanks were alive, they had personalities. You learned what each one could take and what it couldn't." The field workshops of the 8th Army became hives of invention. Crews welded sandbags, spare tracks, and even concrete onto their hulls for extra armoring. They called it the poor man's up-armoring. Mechanics scrounged German parts from wrecked panzers, anything to give their machines a fighting chance. Some Shermans were fitted with captured long-barreled 75mm guns. Others used makeshift track extenders to grip desert sand better. But ingenuity was not limited to the battlefield. Back in Britain, a brilliant engineer named Percy Hobart was quietly changing the game. He had been dismissed early in the war for being too unconventional. Now, under Churchill's orders, he returned to lead the 79th Armored Division, a unit dedicated entirely to experimental tanks. Hobart's funnies, as they became known, were modified Shermans and Churchills that could do what no standard tank could: clear mines, launch bridges, swim, and even flame-burn bunkers. The Allies were learning that survival meant adaptation. Every blown track, every burnt engine taught a lesson. By late 1943, the first of these lessons turned into new blueprints: thicker frontal armor, faster turret rotation, and better radios. The engineers of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, REME, and the U.S. Ordnance Department began to rewrite the Manual of Armored Warfare from scratch. In the mud and smoke of Tunisia, where every mistake was paid in blood, the engineers had become the unsung heroes of survival. They didn't wear medals or command battalions, but without them, the war would have ended differently. And when the tide of war shifted, when the Allies looked across the Channel toward Normandy, it was these quiet innovators who ensured the tanks landing on French soil would no longer be easy prey. They had turned fear into blueprints, and blueprints into steel salvation.
Act 3. The Iron Evolution. This act explores how rapid wartime innovation and industrial adaptation transformed Allied tanks into powerful, reliable machines capable of standing toe-to-toe with the German war machine. By 1944, the Allies had turned their engineering desperation into a full-blown industrial revolution. The clumsy, brittle tanks that had burned in Africa were gone, replaced by machines that bore the scars and lessons of every lost battle. Factories in Detroit, Birmingham, and Glasgow no longer built cars, they forged armor. Thousands of workers, men, women, and even teenagers, became the silent army behind the tanks. In the U.S., the Detroit Arsenal tank plant was producing a Sherman every 30 minutes. Henry Ford's assembly line genius had been reborn for war. Engineers standardized parts so that damaged tanks could be repaired in days, not weeks. Crews joked that the Sherman wasn't the best tank, but it was the one that always showed up. And in war, quantity had its own kind of quality. But numbers weren't enough. German armor still dominated in sheer firepower. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. So Allied engineers fought back, not by matching brute force, but by outsmarting it. Enter the Sherman Firefly, a British conversion that mounted the powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun onto the standard American chassis. It required reconfiguring the turret, repositioning the radio, and rebalancing the entire structure. It wasn't elegant, but it was deadly. A Firefly could knock out a Tiger before the German crew even knew they'd been spotted. In the Soviet Union, the story was different
but equally remarkable. The T-34 evolved into the T-34-85, boasting a larger gun and thicker armor. Soviet factories moved deep into the Urals, hidden from German bombers. There, engineers worked in freezing conditions, assembling tanks by hand with whatever material they could find. A single tank might carry parts from 10 different plants, yet it would still run. Even the Canadians and Australians joined the transformation. They built their own versions of the Sherman, adapted for jungle warfare, fitting wider tracks and flame projectors for the Pacific campaigns. The result was an entire global ecosystem of innovation, a world united by steel and necessity. What began as desperation had become evolution. The tanks of 1944 were not merely vehicles, they were symbols of human adaptability. The men who built them didn't just change machines, they changed the rhythm of the war itself. When the Allies rolled into Normandy that June, they brought with them not just armies, but the culmination of 4 years of engineering ingenuity. On the beaches of France, where failure meant annihilation, their machines no longer limped forward. They thundered.
Act 4. The Storm of Steel. This act plunges into the invasion of Normandy and beyond, where the newly transformed Allied armor faced its greatest test against the German war machine. On June 6, 1944, dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy. The sea was gray, the sky thick with smoke and salt. For the men inside the landing craft, their tanks weren't just weapons, they were lifelines. The Allied invasion depended on them. Without tanks to clear defenses and push inland, the beachheads would drown in blood. But this was no ordinary assault. What rolled onto French soil that morning were the children of desperation, the results of every sleepless night spent welding, forging, and reimagining. The Shermans, Churchills, and specialized Hobart's funnies came roaring out of the surf. Some swam on canvas pontoons, others crushed mines with flails that beat the sand like drumsticks of thunder. On Sword Beach, Churchill AVREs fired 290mm mortars at German bunkers, their shells exploding with enough force to vaporize concrete. On Gold and Juno, crab tanks whipped their spinning chains to detonate mines ahead of infantry. On Omaha, things went wrong. Many of the amphibious tanks sank before reaching the shore. But those that survived proved their worth, shielding men from machine gun fire and breaking through wire and walls alike. For the first time in years, the Allies had armor that could endure, and engineers who could adapt in real time. Beach obstacles became opportunities, wrecked tanks became cover, destroyed bridges were replaced within hours by ingenious Churchill bridge layers. Every mechanical failure was answered not with despair, but with determination. As the breakout from Normandy began, the tank battles became titanic. At Villers-Bocage, a single German Tiger commanded by Michael Wittmann ambushed a British column, destroying over a dozen vehicles in minutes. But unlike in 1940, the Allies could recover. Fireflies returned the favor days later, ambushing Tigers at range with precision fire. The wolves of 1940 now faced a new kind of prey. Leaner, faster, deadlier. By late summer, the Allied advance turned into a steel storm. Operation Cobra saw hundreds of tanks surge across hedgerows and open plains, smashing through German lines. The combination of air power, logistics, and relentless armor pushed the Wehrmacht back on all fronts. Engineers kept the lifeline alive, repairing, rearming, and modifying tanks even as they rolled towards Paris. The war that had once been defined by German innovation was now being rewritten by Allied persistence. The machines of steel had evolved, and their creators had become warriors of the workshop.
Act 5. The Juggernauts of Liberation. This act follows the unstoppable Allied advance from Normandy to Berlin, where tanks evolved from defensive tools into instruments of liberation and vengeance. By autumn of 1944, Europe trembled under the thunder of Allied armor. What had begun as fragile, makeshift machines now rolled across the continent like iron avalanches. Shermans spearheaded the push through France, Cromwells prowled the Dutch canals, and Soviet T-34s crushed their way toward the gates of Warsaw. Each tank carried not just shells and armor, but the dreams of millions waiting to be free. In the fields outside Saint-Lô, entire forests were flattened under tank treads. The sound was no longer one of fear, but inevitability. The once invincible German Tiger, that monster of the early war, now found itself outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out-repaired. For every Tiger destroyed, 5 Shermans took its place. The Allied war machine had become a living organism, fed by logistics, fuel convoys, and the tireless engineers who made the impossible routine. And yet, for all their might, the tank crews were still human. Inside the steel, the war never stopped being personal. Letters from home were tucked behind periscopes. Painted names, Lucky Lady, Belle of the West, Red Star No. 7, adorned turrets like charms against death. When a tank was hit, crews didn't abandon it easily. They fought to the last, knowing the armor they trusted was the only thing between life and oblivion. In Belgium, during the Battle of the Bulge, the snow turned red beneath shattered armor. The cold froze fuel lines and stiffened turret rings. Mechanics crawled through ice at night, thawing engines with blowtorches. The Germans hurled their final armored offensive, King Tigers rolling through the Ardennes like phantoms. But this time, the Allies held. Their tanks were faster to repair, easier to fuel, and no longer outgunned. The tide had permanently turned. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviets unleashed a storm unlike any the world had seen. Tens of thousands of T-34s rolled westward, their crews hammering German lines to dust. Soviet engineers rode in the wake of the assault, erecting makeshift depots and bridge crossings overnight. The Red Army's Steel River advanced so relentlessly that German commanders began calling it Der Panzerstrom, the tank flood. By April 1945, as Allied columns converged on Berlin, the streets themselves became a graveyard of metal. Burned Tigers and Panthers lined the boulevards. Yet amid the devastation, the engineers kept working, recovering wrecks, welding armor, fueling the final push. What had begun with desperation in the sands of North Africa ended here, among the ruins of the Reich, with engines still rumbling beneath the smoke. The tanks had done more than fight. They had symbolized endurance. They carried empires, soldiers, and the will to survive. And when the guns finally fell silent, many of the men who built and drove them looked back in disbelief. They had outlasted the wolves. They had become the storm.
Act 6. The Legacy of Steel. This act reflects on how the wartime ingenuity that birthed the tank revolution reshaped not just armies, but the modern world, from industry to innovation to the meaning of survival itself. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the world that emerged was one built not only on courage, but on engineering. The tank, that clattering, imperfect invention born in the mud of World War I, had reached its maturity. From the fragile Shermans and crude T-34s rose a new generation of armored thought, faster, stronger, smarter, forged in the lessons of desperation. The men who had bent steel in the shadows now shaped nations in the light.
Wartime factories turned to peacetime production. Welding torches that once sealed armor plates now built bridges, ships, and tractors. The same hands that had armored the world now rebuilt it. Engineers carried their battlefield lessons into civilian life. Standardization, mass production, rapid prototyping. Even the concept of modular design, born from tank workshops, became the cornerstone of modern manufacturing. But the legacy wasn't only mechanical, it was human. Tank crews carried home the haunting echo of engines that had saved or doomed them. Many could never forget the feeling of sitting in a metal shell, heart pounding against riveted walls, waiting for the shell that might end everything. Yet they also remembered something else, the ingenuity that kept them alive. The mechanic who patched a radiator under fire. The engineer who welded armor with trembling hands in the cold. The comrade who refused to abandon a burning tank because she'd carried us this far. In museums and memorials across the world today, the great machines stand silent. Tiger, Sherman, Churchill, T-34. Each one a frozen heartbeat of the war that reshaped civilization. Children climb their hulls, unaware that beneath their feet lies the story of millions of unnamed engineers and mechanics whose creativity turned the tide of history. The engineers of World War II did not work for glory. They worked for survival. And in doing so, they redefined the art of war. Every bolt, every weld, every sleepless night inside a makeshift depot became part of a global symphony of human resilience. They proved that ingenuity is the greatest weapon of all. And so, when we remember the heroes of the war, the pilots, the soldiers, the sailors, we should also remember the quiet ones, the welders, the draftsmen, the grease-stained visionaries who turned fragile steel into the unstoppable juggernauts that brought freedom rolling on treads of iron. Because in the end, it wasn't just machines that won the war. It was the minds that dared to change them.
Act 7. The Factories That Moved. This act reveals one of the greatest logistical miracles in history, how Soviet engineers dismantled entire industries and rebuilt them behind the Urals, forging the tanks that would crush the Reich. In the autumn of 1941, as the German Blitz roared towards Moscow, Stalin made a decision that seemed impossible. More than 1,500 factories would be uprooted and sent east, beyond the Volga, beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. Whole assembly lines were torn apart, loaded onto trains, and shipped through snow and chaos into the empty wilderness of the Urals and Siberia. Workers rode with their machines, families, lathes, and livestock packed together. They slept in freezing rail cars beside the same bolts and bearings that would become the Red Army's lifeline. Many died along the way, but the trains kept moving. "We did not retreat," one engineer later said. "We carried the motherland on flatbeds." When the convoys finally reached their destinations, Chelyabinsk, Nizhny Tagil, and Sverdlovsk, there were no buildings waiting, only forest and frost. So they built factories from scratch, sometimes hammering in -30 degrees. They lived in tents beside furnaces that had no walls yet. Out of this suffering rose Tankograd, the city of tanks. At its peak, it produced a T-34 every 40 minutes. The roar of molten steel echoed through the mountains, turning the steppe into a crucible of victory. Soviet engineers simplified everything: single-piece turrets, rugged suspensions, interchangeable parts. They traded polish for reliability. By 1943, this relocated industry was unstoppable. German intelligence could not believe it. The Soviets were producing more tanks than all of Germany and its allies combined. The secret wasn't magic. It was human endurance, organized by sheer willpower. The war's most decisive weapon wasn't just the T-34. It was the factory that refused to die.
Act 8. The Last Gamble of the Reich. This act delves into the twilight of Nazi Germany. when engineering brilliance twisted into obsession, and the race to build the ultimate tank became a desperate act of self-destruction. By 1944, the Reich was bleeding from every front. Its cities burned, its armies shattered, yet its engineers kept designing dreams of invincibility. The once proud Panzerwaffe, those steel wolves of 1940, had become relics, gnawed by time and attrition. In their place, Hitler demanded monsters. He called them Wunderwaffe, miracle weapons. Tanks so vast, so powerful, that they could single-handedly crush the Allied advance. The generals protested. What we need is more tanks, not bigger ones. But Hitler was no longer listening. The dictator who had once relied on speed now sought salvation in size. The result was the Panzerkampfwagen 8 Maus, a 188-ton leviathan of armor and delusion. Its armor was 240 millimeters thick, impervious to almost any Allied gun. Its 128-millimeter cannon could pierce anything on Earth, but it could barely move. Two prototypes were built at enormous cost, consuming precious steel and fuel as the Reich collapsed. It was said that the Maus could only cross bridges by destroying them afterward, because no bridge could bear its weight twice. Parallel to this madness came the E-Series, Germany's attempt to simplify production while scaling power. The E-50 and E-75 were meant to replace the Panthers and Tigers with modular, standardized parts, but it was too late. Allied bombers pounded factories faster than engineers could dream. Many of these tanks never left the blueprint stage. And then there were the secret projects, whispered legends like the Ratte, a 1,000-ton land cruiser that would carry naval cannons across Europe. Historians still debate whether it was ever truly intended for production or if it was just the fever dream of a cornered regime losing touch with reality. Meanwhile, in the field, exhausted panzer crews fought with whatever they had. Fuel shortages turned precision machines into static bunkers. Engineers stripped wrecked tanks for spare parts, turning masterpieces of engineering into grotesque hybrids. One German mechanic wrote in his journal, "We no longer build for victory, we build for survival." The irony was brutal. The nation that had once defined modern armored warfare was now crushed beneath its own over-engineering. As the Allies mass-produced Shermans and T-34s by the tens of thousands, Germany buried its genius under the weight of its own perfectionism. When Berlin finally fell, the Maus lay silent, a dead god among ruins. It had never fired a shot in anger. The ultimate tank of the Reich was also its tombstone.
Act 9. The Empire's Forgotten Machines. This act uncovers the lesser-known stories of Japan and Italy's tank engineers, men who fought isolation, scarcity, and outdated doctrines as the world around them burned faster than they could build. Far from the thunder of Europe's tank battles, in the jungles and islands of the Pacific, the tank war played a different tune. There, steel didn't clash against steel. It sank in mud, rusted in salt, and vanished beneath canopies of green. Japan entered the war with confidence in its armor. The Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Chi-Ha were adequate in China during the 1930s. Fast, lightly armed, perfect for colonial campaigns. But against American Shermans and even Stuart light tanks, they were paper. Their 37mm and 57mm guns barely scratched Allied armor. Their riveted hulls burst apart when hit. Japanese engineers knew this. They weren't blind, they were trapped. The Empire's industry was starved of steel, oil, and time. Shipyards devoured every ton of metal. Aircraft had priority. Tank designers worked with what little they had, developing ingenious substitutes. Thin armor plates hardened through careful tempering, smaller engines finely tuned for efficiency. They experimented with flamethrower tanks and amphibious models for island warfare, but every prototype fought an enemy Japan could never defeat: its own logistics. By 1944, as the war closed in, Japan produced the Type 3 Chinu, its first tank that could challenge a Sherman. Fewer than 200 were ever built. They never left the homeland. When American forces landed on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, Japanese tank crews went to battle in machines that were already obsolete. One officer wrote in his diary, "We know our tanks are weak, but they are still our brothers. We will drive them until they die." Italy's story was no less tragic. Italian engineers, talented but underfunded, had created beautiful yet fragile machines: the M1340, the Semovente 7518. In North Africa, they met the same fate as the early British Matildas: outgunned, under-armored, but brave. Some Italian tankers fought on even after Italy's surrender, repairing their own machines with scavenged German parts, refusing to abandon their craft. These forgotten armies remind us that engineering brilliance means little without resources, and that courage often exists where hope does not. Their tanks may not have shaped history's outcome, but their builders and crews embodied something timeless: the will to create, even when creation seemed meaningless. While the world remembers the Tigers and Shermans, somewhere in the humid silence of a forgotten jungle lies a rusted Chi-Ha, vines wrapping around its turret, nature reclaiming the ambitions of men. It sits there still, the last breath of an empire's forgotten engineers.
Act 10. The Engineer's Reckoning. This final act closes the circle, exploring the moral weight of invention, the silence that followed the storm, and how the men who built the world's deadliest machines learned to live with what they had created. When the war finally ended in 1945, silence fell like ash. The forges went cold. The great factories that had once glowed red with molten steel now stood empty, echoing with the ghosts of engines that would never start again. The engineers, those unseen generals of design and discipline, faced a different kind of reckoning. They had won the war of machines, but now they had to confront the cost of their triumph. In Germany, men who once worshipped precision now sifted through ruins. The blueprints of the Maus and the E-series were seized and shipped westward. American and Soviet scientists pored over them, dissecting every measurement, every alloy. The same happened in Japan, where captured Type 4 and Type 5 prototypes were studied as curiosities, relics from a lost age. What had been secrets of empires became lessons for humanity. But among those who had built the weapons, there was little pride. In a small factory in Nizhny Tagil, a Soviet machinist named Petrov wrote in his notebook, "I made the turret that burned in Berlin. I made the steel that broke men." He was not alone in that guilt. Across continents, the builders of war looked inward and asked the same unanswerable question: did we create to protect life or to perfect destruction? And yet, out of that reckoning came renewal. The same engineers who had designed tanks began designing tractors, bulldozers, and bridges. The factories that had forged death now forged rebuilding. The T-34's engine lived on in Soviet farm equipment. The Sherman suspension inspired post-war transport vehicles. In Detroit and Coventry, tank welders returned to car plants and used wartime innovations to shape the modern automobile industry. They carried scars, not on their bodies, but in their memories. Every rivet, every weld reminded them of the noise, the urgency, the smell of oil and blood mingled in the same air. They had seen the power of human creation and its peril. The tank had taught the world that brilliance without conscience was just another kind of bomb. As decades passed, the survivors aged.
museums filled with the husks of their inventions, the Sherman, the Panther, the T-34, the Type 97. Children touched the cold metal and asked their parents, was this a hero's machine or a monster's? The truth, of course, was both. Because in the end, the engineers of World War II weren't gods or villains, they were people. Dreamers with slide rules and suit-stained vans who built in the belief that what they made might save someone. And perhaps in some small way, it did. The tanks that rolled through hell became lessons carved in steel. That invention is only as noble as the heart that wields it. And when the last engine went quiet, the world finally heard something new. The sound of men who had learned to build without needing to destroy. The story you've just heard isn't only about tanks, it's about people. About how ordinary men and women turned fear into invention, and invention into hope. Every bolt forged, every engine repaired under fire, every silent hour spent over blueprints was an act of defiance against despair. When we look back on the machines of war, it's easy to see them only as tools of destruction. But look closer, and you'll see something else: the brilliance of human minds working under impossible odds. The same minds that built weapons could also build peace if given the chance. The engineers of World War II proved one thing beyond all doubt: innovation can save as much as it can destroy. The line between progress and devastation has never been thinner, and never more our responsibility to guard. So as we leave these stories behind, let's carry their lesson forward. Let's build with the same passion, but for better reasons. Let's use our machines, our technology, our creativity, not to dominate, but to protect. Because the future is being welded together right now, one idea at a time. If the human spirit could turn defeat into invention in the darkest hours of war, imagine what it can build in the light of peace. This is Hidden Frontlines, where we uncover the human stories behind the machines of war. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe, share, and leave your reflections below. Your support keeps history alive, not as relics of destruction, but as lessons for the builders of tomorrow.